Hi, everybody. So I've been asked to talk about how I make bassoon reeds and sort of how I came to this process of how I make bassoon reeds. I would say probably the most obvious thing is I came to it because I started playing the bassoon. And I discovered at some point that it's really hard to play the bassoon well if you don't have a good bassoon reed. And that sounds so flagrantly obvious, I probably shouldn't have even mentioned it, but I hear a lot of people who try to play the bassoon very well and are fighting their reeds so much, and it's so taxing and so difficult for them to play, that it makes me wish that they didn't have to work so hard. So I started studying with Norman Herzberg, who was interestingly enough, pretty much my only teacher. I had a teacher for probably for a little less than a year before I started studying with him, and then I got a job in the Minnesota Orchestra after I finished my second year at USC. So I never really spent much time studying with anybody else, lessons here and there. Anyway, I started studying with him in, I think, 1966, which would be a little over 50 years ago. That's quite a frightening thought to me. And he didn't teach me to make reeds for a while. His thoughts about making reeds were that until somebody had an idea of their own conception of what the bassoon should sound like, that there was no reason for them to try to make their own reeds. So I got them from a variety of sources. We didn't have as many options as young people do now, but we worked on them. So at some point he decided it was time for me to learn to make reeds, and back in those days getting a profiler was not such as easy it is now. We didn't have Pfeiffer wasn't making them at that point, and or if he was, not too many people were getting them. So we were all taught to profile by hand. So I sat in his garage and he showed me how to hand profile a reed, and he shaped it. And so then he said, okay, you do it. And so he stood with me we sat together while he taught me to hand profile. And then I shaped. And then we put it together into what we would call a blank. So I put the wires. At that point, we were scoring and beveling all in one process, and putting all the wires on and forcing the mandrel into it and forming the tube. And what he did at that point, which I thought was very important, I didn't realize it at the time, is he took a block of wood and he hammered 20 nails into it. Just hammered some nails into it. He gave it to me and he says, okay, here's the blank I made. Here's the blank you just made. And now go make 18 more and come back and I'll show you how to finish them. So, okay, being dutiful, I went home, and over a couple of weeks, I think I made then 18 more hand-profiled blanks, put them on this thing. Probably, I wish I had a few of them. I'll bet they're pretty ugly. And put them on this, and he came in and he took the one he had made off and he did a day one on it. And then I took the one I made and I did a day one on it, and made this reed. And at that point, he says, okay, we'll sit it and you'll come back and we'll look at how to finish it from here. He says, but now you've taken 2 blanks off of that and you have to make 2 more to fit it, to fill up that piece of wood, this drawing board. So he says, and you always have to make sure you have it all full, because you want to use ones that are at least 2 weeks old. That's what he said. And to this day, 51 years later, I have never had fewer than 20 blanks. I've always done exactly what Mr. Herzberg said. I always filled up all of those spaces, and have always been making blanks out of reeds out of older blanks. I must say I'm more than 2 weeks ahead at this point. So I keep at home, probably somewhere between 75 or 80 blanks on drawing boards at this point. So I'm usually working 6 months to 9 months ahead with my reeds. Maybe not that much, I don't know. quite a few. So eventually we got profiling machines and we gouged cane. I remember sitting in Norman's garage with the news on, with the Vietnam War at that period of time, him screaming at the television set. It's a long time ago. And so over a period of time, he was not satisfied with the reeds that he was able to make. He found that there were some inherent problems. One of the inherent problems he found was of taking the center of a profile and lining it up with the center of a shape. So he formulated, I think, that one of the most important aspects of this reed machine that he came up with, or the profiler that everyone seems to want, but no one really, once they got it, I don't know if they'd be so happy, was the ability to have centering pins on the shape. So you could shape a piece of cane and it made indentations which were exactly the center of it, 2 indentations, which you could transfer to his profiling machine, so you could exactly make the center of the profile line up with the center of the shape. Since most people don't have a machine like that, I have chosen to go a different direction when I'm working with students that use profiling machines that you can get easily, such as the MD or the Maxwell machines, or if you are lucky enough to get an old Pfeiffer machine, or any of the other ones that, some of them you can't do what I'm about to describe. But what I do is that I turn the pins that have flattened pins. These are the rods that stick into the cane barrel. Usually they have a flattened side on them so that they form a heart. They have set screws, and I turn the set screw and turn them around so there is no spine to rail taper on the profiler. Well, you might say, well, that doesn't seem like a very good idea because you're just making more work for yourself. Well, to a certain extent that's true, but I've worked with a lot of people with this, and it tends to be kind of a problem for them because that flattened pin that goes into the cane barrel that forms this spine tends to make a very pointed spine like this with a very quick drop off between the spine through the channels all the way out to the rails, quite a bit too steep of a drop off. And so what ends up happening is people try to set their machine up according to certain measurements they have along the spine, and the blanks tend to be too thin in the channels, and they don't have enough strength in them to withstand the process of forming the tube, which is pretty intrusive, if you're taking a mandrel and putting it into the reed. So, and they tend to collapse around the mandrel. So I have found that if you want to, you can get a pretty good measurement along the spine, and then what you're doing is you're going to be finishing more of this. And there's going to be a lot of cane on the sides with these, and I'm going to demonstrate this later on with the doing a day one. Is that what you're doing mostly then is you're leaving the spine pretty much alone and doing most of your work to the sides, and you have much greater control over the actual finishing of the reed. Because the problem is this: once we clip a tip on a reed, it tends to be very bright and free blowing after, if it's close to measurement. But if you start off with one of these that has a big spine to rail taper, you blow into it, and it's dull and resistant. And all you can do then is take cane off towards the spine. And the problem is that the reed is breaking in from bright to dark at the same time as you are taking these particular ones from dark to bright. And it's hard to line up what is actually finished on them. I can demonstrate this better when I have a reed in my hands. So I think this is an important thing. I think another very important thing to learning to make good reeds is to make a lot of reeds. It's very difficult. It's difficult to explain to people how to make reeds because most of the cane we get is junk. And so you say, well, if you do this to the reed, it's going to make it better. It's going to do this. And you do it and say, well, it doesn't do much of anything. That's because it's a junky piece of cane. So Norman had this way of describing that, his definition of a good piece of cane, and his definition was one that responds to, his words, respond to the trim, I usually say respond to the work that you do to it, and then doesn't change back. Now, all of us have had reeds that when we scraped them, they changed for 5 minutes, and then 5 minutes later, they're back to being just as terrible as they were before, pretty much the way before. This is one that does not fulfill this requirement of a good piece of cane. It does not stay, it does not keep the trim. So I require my students at the Shepherd School to make 6 reeds a week, and they have to show them to me. Every week they have to show me the 6 reeds that they have made that week. That doesn't mean they have to be good reeds. Most of them are not. I just have to see that they've actually tried to make 6 reeds that week. Then usually we'll have one reed that is good enough that they can either play their lesson on, or we can have a conversation about it and we can work on to help them to be able to play their lesson on it. Over the course of a couple of years, they know how to make reeds. So that's one of the things is you have to make a lot of reeds. You have to cut your losses quickly if a reed is not responding to the work you do to it and is not holding the work you do to it. You have to get it out of your life quickly. This is one of the main reasons why I also make sure that my students gouge their own cane. And it's for a variety of reasons. First of all, you have to split tubes properly to have good reeds, but I think that's been covered, that Ryan covered that elsewhere. But the other thing is that if you gouge your own cane, cane's a lot cheaper. If somebody spends $3 for a stick of cane and you say, well, that's a piece of junk, you need to just throw that away. Well, I've got $3 investment in that piece of cane. But if you gouge it yourself and you have, what, 40, 50 cents, you're more willing to just throw it away. And I think that willingness is important. Another thing which is very important to remember when you are making reeds is you make your reeds for response and intonation and response. Now, I repeated both directions is because sometimes you're more concerned about getting good response, and sometimes you're more concerned about getting good intonation. But you can really get ahead of yourself if you start thinking, well, I have found this today in a lesson I was working with somebody, talking about the difference between, I said, what's wrong with this reed? And the student said, well, it's unstable in the tenor register. I said, what you mean is it's sagging in the tenor register. And they said, yes, that's what it is. What is sagging in the tenor? What does that mean? And he thinks for a minute, and he says, that means it's flat in the tenor register. Right. We have to fix the fact that it's flat in the tenor register. So there's where confusion could ensue, is he would think that, oh, it's unstable, but really what we're dealing with is intonation. If a reed is unstable because it's sharp and riding high, we usually just say that reed is sharp. We don't usually use the expression unstable. But sagging in the tenor register, sagging on certain other notes is usually when we start thinking of instability. At least that's been my experience. So you make your reeds for response and intonation. And a lot of people think, well, that means you're going to have a bad sound. Mr. Herzberg said, I don't care anything about tone. They think that doesn't care about the tone. You make it for response and intonation. Well, he cared deeply about the sound he got on the instrument. But what he was really saying is that to get the sound, to get what I want from the reed, if I try to make it by just making it for sound, it's going to sound dead, it's not going to respond, and it's not going to play in tune. So what he did is and I've changed this expression just a little bit for myself, which is you make your reeds for response and intonation and response, but in that context, and only in that context, you build the sound you want into the reed. And this is more easily done with a reed that does not have the center to side, the spine to side taper that I was talking about earlier in the profile, because this way you have more control over the amount of cane you can take off of the sides and as you're breaking the reed in. So when Herzberg was working on his profiling machine, he showed me this jig that he was using to make the patterns that were going to be copied it was a double barrel profiler, which means it works kind of like a key machine in that you have a pattern that you copy from a cam onto a piece of cane. And it's done this by having two barrels that work in tandem with a linkage. So the way the jig that he used to machine down the patterns on the cam that were going to be copied onto the piece of cane was a thing that took angles and moved it from angle to angle. And I started looking at that, and I began to realize that you could, by keeping the reed, using a file and keeping the reed, which is what I primarily make my reeds with, by keeping the reed on resting on a table when I'm working on it, so this, my hand here being table and this being the reed, and changing the angle of the reed and keeping the file at pretty much parallel to the table, I could change on the reed in exact planes at different angles how I was going to work on my reed. And that if I did a series of overlapping ones like this, I could get a very symmetrical and a very controlled taper on my reeds, both from the back to the front, from the spine to the sides, both perpendicular in a perpendicular way and also in diagonals that were going up towards the corners of the tip. This also I'll demonstrate more when I'm doing these day ones that come later on. But it was really from seeing how symmetrical it could be done using exact angles instead of it being a rolling effect, something like this or like this, because then it's very difficult to keep it from getting gouges in and out and doesn't have a complete an even taper. And the even taper, so that it is from one thickness in the back and is consistently getting thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner without thinner and thinner. Oh, look, there's a little dip there, so the next place is a little thicker. These are going to be breaks in the resonance, and this way I find I'm able to get a reed that resonates nicely, pretty consistently through the whole reed from front to back or back to front, depending, probably it's there are oppositional forces going on as well. So that's kind of how I came up with that, but it really, I got into a real spot. So I would say when I was in my 30s, this would have been back in the 80s, I was in a terrible reed slump. It was terrible. I couldn't make a reed. And I had been keeping notes on thicknesses of my reeds, and I knew what dimensions I liked, using a dial indicator, but nothing was working for me. They were sharp. They played weird. They felt like sharp. They felt too strong, too weak at the same time. All kinds of things. Anyway, so I remember I was on tour. We were doing Tchaikovsky 5. I was on tour, and I was sitting in a Holiday Inn in Salina, Kansas. That's a good image, isn't it? And it happens to be true. And I got to play 5 performances of Tchaikovsky 5. And the solos weren't so much the issue, but making those first entrances with the clarinet right at the beginning were really impossible for me. And I called up, Norman was still living at the time, and I called him up, and I was in tears. I said, Norman, I can't make a reed. He says, what do you mean you can't make a reed? You know how to make a reed. I can't make a reed. And so he said, we went over a couple things, and finally he said something to me. He says, are you practicing your long tones? Well, I did what most students would do at a time like that. I lied. I said, well, not as much as I should. Standard response to when a teacher asks you a question like that. So he says, why do you got to do your long tones? So I went back. What I did is I said, okay, I'm going to forget all those measurements that I had come up with myself. I don't mean, how long the blade was. I'm talking about at such and such a spot, the reed has got to be has to be 60 hundredths of a millimeter, and such a place has to be 35 hundredths of a millimeter. Back has to be such and such. Okay, I said, hell with that. I did my long tones and just made my reeds to play in tune and to respond. Just that. Keeping the basic idea that, yes, it's thicker in the back, thinner in the front. thicker along the spine, thinner on the sides. But I let go of preconceptions. And I gradually dug myself out of this reed slump. And it was that terrible time that really set me on the course to where I ultimately have gone with my reeds. So I try to take comfort every time I'm in a bad situation with my reeds, that I'm going to come out of it knowing more. So try to take some comfort in that when anybody who might be watching this who is a bassoonist, because you will go through many periods of your life where your reeds don't work very well for you. So I think this would be a good time for me to go and make a few reeds.